It's time for our younger ones to go to their different groups. Enjoy, everyone. Adults, we're carrying on our series in 1 Samuel. So this week we are in 1 Samuel 13 and 14. Buckle yourselves in for another good, solid, long reading as well. Keith is going to read chapter 13 for us, and then Sarah is coming up to read chapter 14. She's going to be reading from verse 6 down to verse 45. Thanks, Keith. You're welcome.
Okay, so 1 Samuel chapter 13, and it's entitled Samuel Rebukes Saul. Saul was 30 years old when he became king, and he reigned over Israel for 42 years. Saul chose 3,000 men from Israel. 2,000 were with him at Michmash and in the hill country of Bethel, and 1,000 were with Jonathan at Gibeah in Benjamin. The rest of the men he sent back to their homes. Jonathan attacked the Philistines' outpost at Gibeah, and the Philistines heard about it. Then Saul had the trumpet blown throughout the land and said, "Let the Hebrews hear." So all Israel heard the news. Saul had attacked the Philistine outpost, and now Israel had become obnoxious to the Philistines, and the people were summoned to join Saul at Gilgal. The Philistines assembled to fight Israel with 3,000 chariots, 6,000 charioteers, and soldiers as numerous as the sand on the seashore. They went up and camped at Michmash, east of Bethaven. When the Israelites saw that their situation was critical and that their army was hard-pressed, they hid in caves and thickets among the rocks, and in pits and cisterns. Some Hebrews even crossed the Jordan to the land of Gad and Gilead. Saul remained at Gilgal, and all the troops with him were quaking with fear. He waited for 7 days, the time set by Samuel. But Samuel did not come to Gilgal, and Saul's men began to scatter. So he said, "Bring me the burnt offering and the fellowship offerings." And Saul offered up the burnt offering. Just as he finished making the offering, Samuel arrived, and Saul went out to greet him. "What have you done?" asked Samuel. Saul replied, "When I saw that the men were scattering, and that you did not come at the set time, and that the Philistines were assembling at Michmash, I thought, now the Philistines will come down against me at Gilgal, and I have not sought the Lord's favour. So I felt compelled to offer the burnt offering." "You have done a foolish thing," Samuel said. "You have not kept the command the Lord your God gave you. If you had, he would have established your kingdom over Israel for all time. But now your kingdom will not endure. The Lord has sought out a man after his own heart and appointed him ruler of his people, because you have not kept the Lord's command." Then Samuel left Gilgal and went up to Gibeah in Benjamin, and Saul counted the men who were with him. They numbered about 600. Saul and his son Jonathan and the men who were with him were staying in Gibeah of Benjamin, while the Philistines camped at Michmash. Raiding parties went out from the Philistine camp in 3 detachments. One turned up towards Ophrah in the vicinity of Shual, another towards Beth Horon, and the third towards the borderland overlooking the valley of Zeboim, facing the wilderness. Not a blacksmith could be found in the whole land of Israel, because the Philistines had said, "Otherwise the Hebrews will make swords or spears." So all Israel went down to the Philistines to have their plowshares, mattocks, axes and sickles sharpened. The price was 2/3 of a shekel for sharpening plowshares and mattocks, and 1/3 for a shekel for sharpening forks and axes and for repointing goads. So on the day of the battle, not a soldier with Saul and Jonathan had a sword or spear in his hand. Only Saul and his son Jonathan had them.
And on to chapter 14 and verse 6. Jonathan said to his young armor-bearer, "Come, let's go over to the outpost of those uncircumcised men. Perhaps the Lord will act on our behalf. Nothing can hinder the Lord from saving, whether by many or by few." "Do all that you have in mind," his armor-bearer said. "Go ahead. I am with you in heart and soul." Jonathan said, "Come on then, we will cross towards them and let them see us. If they say to us, 'Wait here until we come to you,' We will stay where we are and not go to them. But if they say, 'Come up to us,' we will climb up, because that will be our sign that the Lord has given them into our hands." So both of them showed themselves to the Philistine outpost. "Look," said the Philistines, "the Hebrews are crawling out of the holes that they were hiding in." The men of the outpost shouted to Jonathan and his armor-bearer, "Come up to us, and we'll teach you a lesson." So Jonathan said to his armor-bearer, "Climb up after me. The Lord has given them into the land of Israel." Jonathan climbed up. And using his hands and feet, with his armor-bearer right behind him, the Philistines fell before Jonathan, and his armor-bearer followed and killed behind him. In that first attack, Jonathan and his armor-bearer killed some 20 men in the area of about half an acre. Israel routs the Philistines. Then panic struck the whole army, those in the camp and field, and those in the outposts and raiding parties, and the ground shook. It was a panic sent by God. Saul's outlooks at Gibeah and Benjamin saw the army melting away in all directions. Then Saul said to the men who were with him, "Muster the forces and see who has left us." When they did, it was Jonathan and his armor-bearer who were not there. Saul said to Elijah, "Bring the ark of God," and at that time was with the Israelites. While Saul was talking to the priest, the tumult in the Philistine camp increased more and more. So Saul said to the priest, "Withdraw your hand." Then Saul and all his men assembled and went to battle. They found the Philistines in total confusion, striking each other with their swords. Those Hebrews who had previously been with the Philistines and had gone up with them to their camp went over to the Israelites who were with Saul and Jonathan. When all the Israelites who had hidden in the hill country of Ephraim heard that the Philistines were on the run, they joined the battle in hot pursuit. So on that day the Lord saved Israel, and the battle moved on beyond Bethaven. Jonathan eats honey. Now the Israelites were in distress that day, because Saul had bound the people under an oath, saying, "Cursed be anyone who eats food before the evening comes, before I have avenged myself on the enemies." So none of the troops tasted food. The entire army entered the woods, and there was honey on the ground. When they went into the woods, they saw the honey oozing out, yet no one put his hand to his mouth, because they feared the oath. But Jonathan had not heard that his father had bound the people with the oath, so he reached out the end of the staff that was in his hand and dipped it into the honeycomb. He raised his hand to his mouth, and his eyes brightened. Then one of his soldiers told him, "Your father bound the army under a strict oath, saying, 'Cursed be anyone who eats food today.' That is why the men are faint." Jonathan said, "My father has made trouble for the country. See how my eyes brightened when I tasted a little of this honey. How much better would it have been if the men had eaten today some of the plunder that they took from their enemies? Would not the slaughter of the Philistines have been greater?" That day, after the Israelites had struck down the Philistines from Michmash and Aijalon, they were exhausted. They pounced on the plunder, and taking sheep, cattle, and calves, they butchered them on the ground and ate them, together with the blood. Then someone said to Saul, "Look at the men. They are sinning against the Lord by eating this meat that has blood in it." "You have broken faith," he said. "Roll a large stone over here at once." Then he said, "Go out among the men and tell them, 'Each of you bring me your cattle and sheep, and slaughter them here and eat them. Do not sin against the Lord by eating meat with blood still in it.'" So everyone brought his ox that night and slaughtered it there. Then Saul built an altar to the Lord. It was the first time he had done this. Saul said, "Let us go down and pursue the Philistines by night and plunder them till dawn. Let us not leave one of them alive." "Do whatever seems best to you," they replied. But the priest said, "Let us inquire of God here." So Saul asked God, "Shall I go down and pursue the Philistines? Will you give them into Israel's hand?" But God did not answer him that day. Saul therefore said, "Come here, all of you who are leaders in the army, and let us find out what sin has been committed today. As surely as the Lord who rescues Israel lives, even if the guilt lies with my son Jonathan, he must die." But not one of them said a word. Saul then said to the Israelites, "You stand over there. I and Jonathan, my son, will stand over here." "Do what seems best to you," they replied. Then Saul prayed to the Lord, the God of Israel, "Why have you not answered your servant today? If the fault is with me or my son Jonathan, respond with Urim. But the men of Israel are at fault. But if the men of Israel are at fault, respond with Thummim. Jonathan and Saul were taken by lot, and the men were cleared. Paul said, "Cast the lot between me and Jonathan my son," and Jonathan was taken. Then Saul said to Jonathan, "Tell me what you have done." So Jonathan told him, "I tasted a little of the honey with the end of my staff, and now I must die." Paul said, "May God deal with me, be it ever so severely, if you do not die, Jonathan." But the men said to Saul, Should Jonathan die, he who has brought about this great deliverance in Israel? Never, as surely as the Lord lives, not a hair on his head shall fall to the ground. For he did this today with God's help. So the men rescued Jonathan, and he was not put to death.
Good morning. Do you sometimes feel you don't know what to do in a certain situation, or don't know which way to turn? Or have you reached the same stage as me? You go upstairs for something, and when you get there, you can't remember what you went up for. Well, don't worry, if you're not there yet, it'll come to you one day. It was rather like that, not knowing what to do or which way to turn for God's people, the Israelites, in the 2 chapters we've just had read to us. Thank you very much, Keith and Sarah. Where are we up to in 1 Samuel? Samuel's just anointed Saul as their first king, against his better judgment. The people had asked for a king so they could be like the other nations around them, and God had agreed. But he told Samuel to warn them what it would be like having a king to rule over them, and Samuel's done that. Samuel's just made his farewell address to the people of Israel in chapter 12. Though Samuel's still got a lot to do, and he doesn't die until chapter 25. Chapter 13. Saul's been king for a while. Chapter 13 starts with a typical summary of the life of a king in those days. It's frustrating. Well, actually, the NIV did tell us how old Saul was when he started to reign, or how long he reigned for. But in the older versions, the first number's missing, and the second's incomplete. So we're not absolutely sure of those numbers. Saul's situation is somewhat different from ours, as the 2 chapters concern warfare. There are parts of the world that are suffering warfare at this time, but for us, that's not the case. In verse 2, Saul chooses his army, 2,000 to serve with him and 1,000 with his son Jonathan. He's now old enough to lead part of the army, and Saul sends the rest home. Jonathan defeats a Philistine garrison. Saul makes sure the people hear about this, and he summons them to join him. This is a change in circumstances. The Philistines aren't happy. They gather to fight the Israelites. Their army consists of 30,000 chariots, 6,000 horsemen, and too many foot soldiers to count. Not surprisingly, the Israelites are scared, and they hide wherever they can, or they flee across the Jordan. And the people left with Saul follow him, trembling. Saul's waiting for Samuel to arrive so he can sacrifice before they go into battle. And he waits the 7 days that were agreed, but there's no sign of Samuel. And Saul decides to offer the sacrifice himself. As soon as he's finished, Samuel arrives and asks him what he's done. Saul explains that his army was deserting. The Philistines were gathering for action, so he decided to offer the sacrifice himself. As soon as he's finished, Saul arrives and asks him what he's done. Saul explains his army was deserting. The Philistines were gathering for action, so he decided to offer the sacrifice himself. Samuel's got bad news for Saul. He's not kept God's command. Jonathan will not become king after him. And God's chosen someone else to reign instead of him. And Samuel leaves at that point. This is Saul's first big mistake. He fails to seek God's help and takes matters into his own hands. We may be tempted to do things in our own strength rather than relying on God to help us. Let's take a lesson from Samuel's life and wait on God to show us the way and give us the strength to serve him. It's vital to do what God tells us to do. Saul numbers his army and finds he's only got 600 men. Do you remember how many the Philistines had? The Philistines send out raiders in 3 companies. The Israelites are at another disadvantage as well as numbers, as only Saul and Jonathan have iron weapons. There are no blacksmiths in Israel. The Philistines had made sure of that to prevent them getting weapons. Now we move into chapter 14. The start of chapter 14 takes us back to Jonathan. He decides to take his army bearer to the Philistine garrison and reconnoiter their position. And he decides to do that without telling his father Saul. And it involves climbing over a pass between 2 rocky crags. Not something for the faint-hearted. Jonathan tells his young armor-bearer his plan, starting off by saying he hopes the Lord will work for them. The plan is they're to show themselves to the enemy. If they tell them to wait while they come to do that to them, they'll do that. But if they tell them to come up to them, they'll do that because it'll mean the Lord has given them into their hand. Jonathan and his armor-bearer show themselves to the Philistines, and the Philistines challenge them to come up to them. Jonathan said, "The Lord's given them into our hands." They have to climb on hands and feet to reach them. They kill about 20 of them, and it leads to panic in the Philistine camp. And there's an earthquake. Saul and the 600 or so men with him see this. Saul checks who's missing and finds it's Jonathan and his armor-bearer. He then sends for the ark of God, but he changes his mind when it's clear the Philistines are in complete confusion, and Saul and his army go into battle. They're joined by Israel, who deserted to the Philistines, and those who had hidden earlier. The writer's conclusion is, so the Lord saved Israel that day. Jonathan again turns out to be the man of action and succeeds in his courageous plan, having put his trust in God to save. Saul does rise to the occasion, and the Lord saves Israel that day. Verse 24 of chapter 14 brings us to another failure on Saul's part. The Israelites have had a tough day fighting with the Philistines. Saul lays an oath on his men. They're not to eat in anything until the sun set and the Philistines are defeated. They come to a forest and honey is dropping on the ground, but the men, by and large, respect Saul's oath. Jonathan hadn't heard that oath and puts the tip of his staff in the honeycomb, eats the honey, and his eyes become bright. Then someone tells him about his father's oath. Jonathan says it would have been better if they'd all eaten to give them strength to fight and utterly defeat the Philistines rather than just partially. At nightfall, the people kill the animals they've taken and eat them with the blood. Saul's told about this sin and sets up an altar for the people to bring their animals and have them slain properly. Remember, God, through Moses, told the people how they were to kill animals and they weren't to eat them with blood. This is the first altar that Saul builds to the Lord. He wants to finish the rout of the Philistines, and the priest advises him to seek God's will, which he does. But there's no answer from God. He decides there's sin in the camp, and whoever is guilty must die, even if it's Jonathan, his son. They cast lots, and Jonathan's found guilty. He admits his guilt. He's prepared to die, but the people refuse to let this happen, and they ransom Jonathan. We're not told how. Chapter 14 ends with a list of Saul's victories, his family, and his recruitment process. He wants to increase the numbers in his army. Saul's rash oath almost led to the killing of his son, which was only averted by the people's act. We need to consider the consequences of our actions, what we do. We need to seek the Lord's advice and will. There are many hints in the Old Testament that God is going to send someone special. They start in Genesis 3:15 with God's promise that Eve's offspring will bruise the serpent's head. There are many hints in the Psalms, someone special coming. Isaiah talks about God's suffering servant who will bear our griefs and carry our sorrows. And in our passage today, there's another hint. Samuel tells Saul that the Lord sought out a man after his own heart and commanded him to be a prince over his people. This is the first mention of David. And as the hymn, Hail to the Lord's Anointed, puts it, great David's greatest son. That's the one God has in mind to come. As Nathan said a few weeks ago, God would send Jesus to die in our place on the cross that we might go free and not bear the consequence of our sin. That's what the Old Testament is all the way leading up to, preparing us for the coming of someone special. And that special was his own Son, the Lord Jesus Christ. He would come. He would teach the people. But then, in a terrible way, he'd be put to death on the cross. But it's that death, as we've just remembered in the bread and wine, that deals with our sin. That means we can approach God and come to him through Christ who died in our place. Is Jesus your Saviour? Consider that question. That's important, a vital question. Thanks, Rich.
Thanks, Andrew. We're going to pray and then we're going to sing.